Recently, I added a full undo system to my game Slither Jones. You can undo any action you've done with the Z key. In this video, I'm going to explain how I did it in the Godot game engine. Slither Jones is a puzzle game where you control a snake that can detach the blocks on his tail. You know that classic game, Snake, where you eat the apples and you grow longer and longer? I was like, what if this was a puzzle game? It's kind of like a combination of Snake and Tetris. You eat apples to gain blocks, and then you can hit this switch tile to detach the blocks. All the puzzles revolve around this mechanic. Recently, I've been playing Baba Is You, a puzzle game where you push around these rule blocks to change the rules of the game to solve puzzles. And I really like its undo system. It helps the puzzles be less punishing if you get stuck, and it's really fun to watch. So I tried implementing this system in my game. I've never looked up a tutorial for this because I wanted to see if I could figure it out myself. As a computer science graduate, I thought, I should be able to figure out something like this, right? After thinking about it for a while, I realized there are two main approaches to the problem. You can either save every action the player takes and then reverse each of those moves, or you can save the state of the entire level each time the player takes an action, and then simply load that state when they undo. There are pros and cons to both. The first is more efficient because you only need to store what changes with each of those actions. However, it could be more prone to bugs if the order you restore changes is off, or if you store the wrong thing when the player makes an action. The second could be easier to implement because you only need to save and load the state of the level. However, you do need to figure out how you save and load the state of the level, which could get complicated. So maybe both are hard in their own ways. I went with the first approach because I wanted to see how challenging it is to implement. Surprisingly, it wasn't impossible to figure out, although it took me a few days to finish it. The first part was figuring out how to store the actions, and unfortunately, Godot doesn't have a stack data structure, which annoyed me to no end. Thankfully though, you can use an array just like a stack. An array in programming is basically just a list, where you can index into any element. A stack is like an array, but you can only push to, pop, and access the top element. Anyways, it was frustrating because I finally found the perfect situation to use a stack, and then I found out I actually can't. Whatever, maybe I'll be able to finally use it someday. The next thing I realized is that there are two things we need to track with this list: player inputs and the consequences of those inputs. In Slither Jones, the only actions the player can take through their keyboard inputs are moving in 4 directions. However, where they move has consequences in the world, such as detaching their blocks, pushing blocks, eating an apple, etc. So I created a struct called player action that can keep track of these actions and consequences. Thus, undoing an action is really just doing the opposite thing. I'm not supposed to give my personal opinion, but I think that's pretty epic. Obviously, for the movement action, it's moving in the opposite direction that we want. We can do this by simply negating the movement vector. A vector is simply a direction in math, and making it negative gives you the opposite direction. Then for eating an apple, it's spawning an apple in the position it was eaten. Spawning is a game programming term for bringing a game object or entity into its world by instantiating it. Next was figuring out how to undo pushing blocks. I decided to just make it simple and to store whether the player pushed blocks that action and which blocks they pushed. I call them block clusters in the code. We can use the direction the player moved to figure out how to undo their movement. Last was figuring out how to undo detaching from blocks. This was the hardest part because the detached block clusters are part of the level, but I had to figure out how to return them to the player's tail blocks list. And the blocks are grouped by color, so I had to still store the order of the blocks before they detached so I could restore that order. But when the player reattaches to the blocks, they should be returned to their original position, so we don't have to worry about that. Basically, it would be hard to explain the whole way I did it, but I go through each block and reparent to the player. It might not be the best solution, but it works, so if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I hope this video was interesting or helpful. I hope you can see that you don't have to look up a tutorial for everything when making your first games. Try and figure it out yourself first, and you might be surprised with what you can make. This whole game was made without looking up almost anything on how to create it. This game never existed before I made it, so there was no tutorial on how to make Slither Jones episode 37 or whatever. So anyways, if you're interested in the game, then stay tuned for when I release it by subscribing or whatever. Alright, adios.